On this episode of INI9, I have with me Dr. David Malone, President of Canada's IDRC, and a great scholar of Indian foreign policy.
Thank you.
And we're going to talk about foreign policy and the language of values and interests. Because one of the ideas it's an hypothesis which came into my head was when countries have little power, they tend to speak a lot more on the language of values in terms of foreign policy. But as they begin to accumulate power, they speak the language of interests. The question I have is that at a certain point in time, when they are powerful enough, do they start talking the language of values again? Because a country would be powerful, would have interests which are global in nature, the society would be exposed to the external world. And if the country is democratic and has values, which are, in terms of human rights, in terms of democracy, would these values surface in foreign policy?
Well, I think all countries like to think they have values. A value we may not think of as a value, for example, is respect for absolute sovereignty of states. The Russian Federation, for example, would probably consider that a value. Many of the rest of us think that worshipping at the altar of absolute sovereignty of states is an abdication of values. So the mere concept of values can be played several ways. I think the one baseline in all foreign policies is a sense of what the national interest is. If you're Luxembourg and you don't worry about your territorial integrity because your neighbors are friendly countries, your base interests might be protecting the offshore banking business. So it's not something most of us would think of as a very compelling national interest, but to Luxembourg it's very important. And when Luxembourg's offshore banking status was attacked by those who were looking to combat money laundering, Luxembourg fought like a lion to protect itself. And Luxembourg is a country that thinks it has very high moral values. So I think we all have interests. The extent to which values play in, I think they do at the UN and in multilateral organizations for small countries, because they allow these small countries to become norm entrepreneurs. They may not matter at the level of power or geostrategy. Where are their battalions? Well, they don't have any. But they have ideas. And at the UN, with enough company, these ideas can be transformed into treaties, and the treaties can command the attention even of the very powerful. So I think the reason small countries are attracted to values isn't so much that their values are exceptional or their ideas exceptionally good, but because in the absence of power, it's what they can work with. And my country, Canada, which is a leading middle-sized power, is caught in between the two. We have very significant economic influence and resources, but geostrategically we have quite limited power. So quite often throughout Canadian history we've played on values, and just at the moment we're playing very much on Canadian interests, making something out of our natural resources, making ourselves matter that way.
But how would you now? If you put this in the context of India, right?
Yes,
that's what we are interested about. Is we've seen at least in the last 15 years a lot of foreign policy behavior is dominated by interests.
Yes.
Now, realists like me would say this is a great thing because accumulation of power is very important at this stage. But looking forward, do you think we would reach a point where a powerful India would go back to pursuing a foreign policy of values of the kind which, let's make it controversial, of the values the kind that the West espouses today?
Well, I wrote an article in Economic and Political Weekly recently, which argued that India could, to its advantage, play on some elements of soft power that it's ignored so far. When India thinks of soft power, it mainly practices public diplomacy. It advertises through Incredible India, a very successful campaign, the splendors of its monuments, its landscapes, and its culture. But actually, the glory of India is much more than that. The glory of India is its fractious democracy, its struggle for human rights. The fact that the struggle for human rights is incomplete, insufficiently successful, doesn't make it any less glorious.
Right.
I would argue that India, to make itself even more attractive than it already is, should talk more of those features of its domestic makeup than it does. But it doesn't. And why doesn't it? Because of its very strong attachment to the sovereign equality of states, and its view that it shouldn't be embarrassing other states with its own democratic and human rights assets, however flawed.
That's right. So it's like this revulsion to having double standards.
Yes.
So it's you feel that on one hand you feel that the post-colonial experience is still young. So there are people who have memories of colonial rule and who are very sensitive to external imposition of values.
Absolutely.
And at the same time, you have a need to go out into the world and demonstrate the Indian model, which in a way, by speaking the values of the language of values, also speaks the language of power, because you have normative power in that sense.
Well, I think the Arab Spring has been a very interesting and unsettling test for Indian foreign policy professionals and the defense establishment also. Why? Because West Asia really matters to India economically. Speaking of interests, there are some important Indian interests. Secondly, there is the long Indian tradition of dealing with whatever government is in place, whether India is emotionally drawn or drawn through values to that government or not. But here we have countries rising up against their own leaderships, and more puzzling than that, because countries have risen up against their own leaderships, Indians often have, throughout their history.
Always.
Quite a lot. We have the regional organization for the Arabs, the Arab League, which had been a dead letter, very quiescent, never doing anything except supporting pretty abusive regimes. All of a sudden, under pressure of Qatar and events on the Arab streets, suddenly deciding that Gaddafi had to go, and now deciding that it's time for Assad to go. This is very unsettling for India, because the Arab League, in a way, crystallizes Arab opinion. And India has always wanted to defer to foreign and regional opinion and not want to be ahead of it, but never particularly to want to be way behind it either. And yet it finds itself way behind it this time.